You're talking about, yeah, just discussion or maybe even debates that arise in the classroom.
Yeah. It just depends on the nature of the course, but yeah, graduate students especially like to, kind of share their thoughts, and the dialectic method of kind of back and forth, give and take is just, yeah, really helpful to, kind of logically thinking through a point, a position, and then, having another person respond to it. You kind of see maybe where your logic was off, and you can kind of see a better vantage point. And so there's a great kind of merit to that discussion and to that method. And just, yeah, like I said, it depends on the nature of the course and kind of what you're talking about. And yeah, so
It's interesting that you, maybe not quite this quickly or simply, but have gone from teaching in a high school to teaching graduate level theology. I imagine those two things are pretty different.
Yes and no. So Dr. Stevenson and I both formally taught in high school. I think he did for longer than I did. I did for 5 years. And sometimes we joke, like, if you can teach high schoolers, you could kind of teach anybody in a way, because high schoolers
Shouts out to all the high school religion students out there.
No, so what's tough about teaching high school is that my former headmaster, Dr. Kevin Ferdinand, put it this way, like, they can smell BS in like 15 minutes. So like sure. you gotta be there, and gotta be like something of like the real deal, like be genuine and really sincere. Otherwise they can smell that out. They can sniff that out. And so that's there's something like a good taxing quality to teaching high school, because you've got 5, maybe 6 classes every day, and it's 45 minutes and usually something like that, and you're on consistently every day throughout the day, teaching. And as a college professor in graduate programs, there's a lot more space and time in between classes. And so that's one of the big differences, is just how much time am I in the classroom proportionately to whatever else I'm doing. But as far as what happens in the classroom, sometimes high schoolers are just really critical, and that's it's just kind of part of the natural progression and development of their age, and so that they're trying to question the world, and that's actually a natural and good thing, right? Like, I think Pope Paul VI talks about that as like, we don't want to like shy away from that. We want to kind of encourage and let that happen, because that's part of how we naturally develop. And there's a certain kind of ownership that comes through that process. And so, I don't think a day would go by where, as a high school teacher, like whatever we were talking about, it could be all sorts of things. It could be on the sacraments. It could be on something from the scriptures. It could be, Trinity. It could be all over the place. Somebody would raise an objection to, even at a very fundamental level sometimes. So that helps you to know how to teach better, because you have to be able to articulate. Not that I was always successful or anything like that, but you have to always articulate better, more clearly, I guess more convincingly. It's not like apologetics per se, but there's always a little bit of that element of apologetics in high school. So it just so that there's a lot of skills that are gained in teaching high school that easily translate to all sorts of other teaching environments.
Sure.
The thing about being teaching at a graduate seminary is that there's an opt-in factor for all the students, that they're there by volition.
Yeah.
In some ultimate way, not that every seminarian wants to be in your class particularly or something, but but they are there in that environment because they've chosen to be so, and so that comes with a certain kind of built-in bonus where you can presuppose some things, and there's a certain buy-in.
Yeah.
You also can presuppose, as a difference from teaching high school, like high schoolers, like I said, have this kind of critical viewpoint. Not that that goes away, but there's a certain kind of assent in faith that you can presuppose in most of the graduate students, or I would say all the students really, that you're not doing as much of the apologetics in that. I don't want to say the battle, but just the kind of that dialectic is not as prevalent, and so, which actually, sometimes you lose something in that, but you also gain the opportunity to actually kind of be able to go deeper, sometimes more objective and maybe less emotive. But it allows you to presuppose certain things so that you can get to the other things that are actually maybe a deeper truth, a more important truth, or so there are differences there for sure. Yeah. Well, and there's also the fact that, like, when I've taught permanent deacon candidates, I'm the youngest person in the room, so there's this weird, like I could be the father to some of the high schoolers I was teaching.
Right.
And now I could be the son to some of the students I have in some of the courses.
Is there something that has to be overcome there? Or you just kind of own it, or because that is different? Yeah.
I think initially you're like intimidating. You walk in and you're like, everybody's older than me.
This guy should be teaching me things.
I know, and there's some of them. I mean, like really high achieving attorneys, or like. A guy
in permanent diaconate.
Yeah, right. Or fill in the blank. They all sorts of qualifications. Helping to run a nuclear facility or something. They're really bright dudes, and but they have a kind of natural humility themselves. That helped a lot, and I just a kind of confidence in my own preparation, and I have a job. I have a job to do, and I show up and do my job. Just like anybody else that shows up, punches the clock, and gets to work. At a certain point, you got to just do it. And once you do it, once you get started doing it, for me, it was getting through that first lecture, and then because that was my very first semester teaching at the seminary. It was teaching permanent deacons that were all older than me, and here I am. Just a few months ago was teaching high schoolers, and but it was a beautiful transition. They received me super well, and we had a great time together, and we just had fun too. We were kind of real with each other, which was good.
That's awesome. Do you feel a certain weight, good, bad, or indifferent, knowing that you are forming potential future priests, future deacons, lay leaders? Like, there is a level of responsibility that comes with that, but at the same time, like you said, it's almost like you don't want to take it too seriously and like put too much pressure on yourself. Or how do you kind of balance all that in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I take it very seriously, and I think really all the lay faculty, especially, but all the faculty at the seminary probably do. We see this as really important work, and I think we also have seen where maybe where some formation and education has been in the past, and what some of that has kind of led to or allowed for. And so those warnings are kind of on, not like forefront on the mind, but it's always kind of there. There's a certain awareness of,
your eyes are wide open.
This matters, and like, not that the other thing is, everybody's got free will. I can't determine what's going to become of anybody in particular or anything like that, but I do want to make sure they're equipped, and that is my responsibility. Gratefully, the pressure is off insofar as it's not solely my responsibility. Right. I'm part of a team. That's kind of how the seminary is. It is one big team that way, and everybody's playing their different parts, from priest formators to faculty to even just the people that are kind of admin assistants to different programming or whatever. There's we're all part of that formation team in a way, and so that takes a little bit of that pressure off. I am responsible, especially for the intellectual piece, and part of the job of being a seminary educator is that, at an archdiocesan seminary, I'm here effectively on behalf of Archbishop Hebda. That's the kind of ecclesiastical appointment dimension, and at the beginning of the year, we have the big opening mass and make an oath of fidelity and give that directly in person to the Archbishop, and so I'm kind of his delegate in a way, so he's really ultimately the one in charge of the intellectual formation of the seminarians and all the other students, as this is his seminary in a way. And so I'm here to help with that, which, like I said, takes a little bit of the pressure off, but also has a seriousness to it, that I need to represent the church and represent the Archbishop, and I'm entrusted with that dimension of the task of formation, especially the intellectual academic formation. So I have a certain seriousness about it, that I want to make sure that they are formed well and they know what they need to know. And so I try to always approach teaching with a certain view to what we call the pastoral dimension. So how is this going to be relevant to when they're operating as a priest, for instance? And so thinking about it in terms of, so teaching moral theology, there's often where I'll make a connecting point to what might be coming up in the sacrament of confession, for instance. Like, how would this be relevant to that situation? And so making those practical connections, which is good for the men in formation too, as they need to make those connections. And some of them are wondering, why do I need to know this?
Sure.
And maybe they'll make that explicit, or it's at least in their mind, like, why do I need to know all these things? So I find it important to try to do that for them, that the intellectual serves their pastoral future.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. Do you always want to do this type of work, or how did you kind of get into education? Just walk us through the journey.
Yeah. Well, so when I was a teenager, I had some significant, like conversion experiences. I grew up Catholic.
Yeah.
But got invited to some like kind of teen retreats, basically, and that really helped to solidify and deepen my my relationship with the Lord and my own kind of appropriation of my faith. And out of that, and stepping into some of the service dimensions of that, helping to lead some of those things, giving some talks, that kind of thing, I kind of had a sense that I maybe wanted to teach. So for a while I was, kind of back and forth on maybe going into engineering or even like electrician work, or I had a few different things that was kind of on the table. But then teaching was always kind of there as well. And so the big thing as I was kind of coming to the end of high school was like computer science. I got really involved in high school with helping our high school network administrator. I was literally his lackey. I spent my study hall periods. I literally had 2 study hall periods that senior year where he would just send me out to go fix printers and help teachers with it.
You were the IT guy.
I was the IT guy as a student. And there was a few other students that did the same. And then I spent the summer after high school working with the guy intensively for 3 months, ghosting computers and it literally vacuum out the dust and like tearing them down, putting them together, routers and everything. So I went into college thinking I want to do computer information systems, and was doing some programming, which I had done in high school, and then just kind of realized, I don't know if I really want to do this.
Yeah.
So I switched to a philosophy major because I thought, you know what, maybe teaching is the thing. And I always kind of had a heart in that direction, and thought I wanted to study theology to maybe be like a high school religion teacher. And so I ended up switching to philosophy because I was at a junior college, and it turns out they didn't have theology at junior college. But they had philosophy, so I started doing philosophy, and I knew that seminarians studied philosophy before they studied theology. It was kind of ironic because then I eventually ended up going into the seminary myself.
Okay.
As a college seminarian, what we call minor seminary or discipleship stage is what we call it nowadays. Just wait another 10 years. We'll probably call it something else, right?
Yeah. We got to keep printing, new versions.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Keep people like you on your toes.
Yeah. So so I went into the seminary, study philosophy, and ended up discerning out after 2.5 years. College seminary is one of the best things I ever did, as far as just kind of putting me on the trajectory of my life. Because I could have went all sorts of different ways. Entering seminary was maybe the most important thing in my whole life. Basically, it's like neck and neck with marrying my wife as far as like major decisions.
Sure.
That has set me on a path.
Well, and I assume the formation and discernment that happened during those
Absolutely.
couple years put you on the path to
to
discern the marriage vocation, to find your wife,
and in a particular way, and not just like go into marriage, but just a kind of a certain intentionality of it.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that was huge for me to go into to do seminary, but I discerned out. But actually, I'll just tell the story, so because it's relevant to being at the St. Paul Seminary. So during my senior year of college, I was the first half was in the seminary still, and senior year of college seminary is when you really start thinking seriously about. Not that you're not thinking seriously about priesthood, but you start really seriously thinking like, can I commit to entering into major seminary?
Right.
Can I? Because that's a big transition. Because college seminary, it's more discernment heavy. When you enter into major seminary like the St. Paul Seminary, not that there's not discernment anymore, because you're still discerning. You're still praying through whether God's calling you to be a priest, and the church is still discerning that. The seminary formators are discerning that. But in a certain kind of way, you have a commitment there, and it's less about the discernment and more about the formation for.
That's right.
No, it's still both.
It's the next step.
It's the next step, and it's kind of a little bit more serious.
Yeah.
And so once you get to senior year of college seminary, you're thinking, am I ready to commit to major seminary? And so I was kind of going through some of that. And one of the things my vocation director and my bishop wanted my class to do is to look at some different seminaries other than where my diocese was sending. And one of those was to look at St. Paul Seminary. So we come up here and we visit, I think there were 4 of us, if I remember right, from my diocese that were visiting. And it was early in fall semester, and turns out it was a free weekend. So, for the context, free weekend means like seminarians are basically gone. Yeah. They do whatever they want. They go on. Some of them like go camping with some of the guys, or whatever. They go back home and see family. They do all sorts of stuff. It literally is a break, a little miniature break. So we're coming and visiting on this free weekend. There's like nobody around.
Yeah, it's very quiet.
There's no classes on that Friday or something like that. Anyway, so it didn't work out for us to get a good sense of like what's going on at St. Paul Seminary.
Yeah.
But I had a friend that had graduated from St. Mary's, where I was as an undergrad, a year before me, and she was a lay student at the St. Paul Seminary. And so when at St. Mary's we had our fall break, she said, "Hey, why don't you come up and you can stay at the seminary again, and then you can just join me for a couple of my lay classes if you want to get a better look at things, and just come up and see the cities, because when you're in school in Winona, St. Paul's a lot cooler than Winona." Winona's awesome, but it's small,
And then there are days when you're in St. Paul, it's like,
Winona would be nice.
Sounds really nice right now. It's funny how that shifts, but yeah.
So anyway,
you got to come back and get a better.
I came back up, and I sat in on 2 classes. One of which was fundamental moral theology with Dr. Christopher Thompson, who's now our academic dean.
Sir.
And the other one was ecclesiology with Dr. Christian Washburn, who's a colleague of mine now. And both of those classes, and I was toying with a minor in theology. I didn't actually end up getting it. I think it was like 2 classes away from it. But I was taking a lot of theology classes at St. Mary's. And anyway, there was something about taking the theology classes here, sitting in. I thought, this is awesome. These guys are doing the theology like the way I want to do it. I had the thought as I was going back to Winona, if I were not in the seminary, I would want to get my master's at this school.
Wow.
In theology. And then lo and behold, like 3 months later, I'm discerning to leave the seminary. And it had kind of been gradually building to that point, but it became really definitive like January of that year. So I left, and then my first thought was, what am I going to do now? Because I was, maybe going to go be a priest, or at least go into major seminary. And now it's like, what am I going to do now? And then I thought, maybe I should just go get my master's. And so I didn't apply anywhere else. I just applied to the Saint Paul Seminary, got in, and started as a lay student. And anyway, fast forward, and now, Dr. Thompson is my dean, my boss, and Dr. Washburn is my colleague. We have offices right next to each other, and so
that's a very full circle.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure exactly where the question started.
We're just walking through your journey. So you got your master's.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Well,
I glossed over that,
the question started. The question started with teaching and how I ended up.
How you got into it? Yeah. You got your master's. That was just this simple box you checked, but obviously there's.
Yeah, I was just talking.
Time in there.
Yeah, no, exactly. I was just talking to a former student from the MA programs last night, who had a tough time just getting done because he had a lot of life stuff going on. He was working full time and taking 3 classes, and we were reminiscing about how when he was in my class, and I just told I remember telling him he opened up about how he was struggling with just getting through everything, and life was demanding, and I just remember telling him just come to class, make sure you're at class, you're gonna make it through, and it was a lot to get done with the degree, and it was the same for me. So, but as far as kind of how that went from there, so I left seminary, due to the master's in theology, kind of reverted back in a way in my mind, my intention to, I'll get my master's in theology and I'll go teach high school.
Yeah.
And I actually was working part-time in a local high school, Visitation High School. It was actually for the whole school, so K through 12, in the dining room. So part of me taking that job was I needed a job, and it was a job. And part of it was just get my kind of foot in the door with being in a local Catholic school. Not that I was expecting them to give me a job at some point, but it was just to kind of get some good experience, being around students and working with students, because I never taught before or anything, and it was actually a fantastic experience. I'm very indebted to especially some of the administration there. Renee Gavick is head of school now, and she was upper school director at the time, and just super helpful for me in my formation and learning how to work with young people. But so I was thinking I'll get the master's and I'll go teach. Maybe I'll work in youth ministry. Actually interviewed for some youth ministry jobs when I first moved up here, and long story short, that didn't work out, but I was still kind of thinking along those lines. But as I was taking classes with folks like Dr. Washburn and Dr. Thompson, Dr. Stephen Hipp, now Bishop Juan Miguel Betancourt, and others, Dr. John Martins. I'm sure I'm blanking on a couple people. People would start saying things to me like, "Have you ever thought about doing a doctoral studies? Have you ever thought about a PhD program?" And my answer is always well, not really. It's why? Do you think I should? Because
you're asking for a reason, probably. Right?
Exactly. Right. I must be showing them something, but my dad didn't get his. He went back, eventually got his GED, but he never went on to college. Didn't even finish high school initially. My mom finished high school and then didn't, go on from there. Eventually went back and got an associate's degree. So I didn't come from a family of high education. My grandfather, who was actually a permanent deacon, got his master's in education and was middle school principal for a long time. And then, something like a couple uncles and, others that had done some things, but that was kind of the extent. And like I said, at least my immediate family, it wasn't a culture of my poor kids are getting brought up, and half the adults they know go by doctor, so they're just in that world.
Your upbringing,
yeah. So very different. So the idea of doing a PhD just was weird. It's foreign, and it was not on the radar. But then they helped me to see something that I didn't see in myself, which was I'm still so grateful for them and their mentorship. especially Dr. Thompson and Dr. Washburn, who I'm really grateful to have as colleagues now. So I applied to a few programs, and it was kind of I'll apply and see what happens, and if I don't get in, then I'll start teaching high school.
Sure.
And turns out I got in. I got into Ave Maria. I won't say the other schools I applied to, one of which rejected me like within 2 weeks. But I got
into. Look at him now.
I know, right? Yeah. Take that.
Yeah.
I got into Ave Maria, and it was kind of like, all right, this is where I'm going. God made it clear that this is my path. And it was like a week later that I proposed to my wife, because
I was gonna say,
there's a little tracking of theirs, whereas and part of it for me was, I was kind of hesitating to propose because I didn't know what the heck I was doing with my life, and didn't want to like invite this woman along for this grand mystery.
Yeah.
I wanted to have something of maybe it's like my compartmentalizing brain. I wanted to figure this out so that I can move on and figure the other thing out. But at least I thought it was well-intentioned, where I wanted to have something of a future then to invite her into, so to speak. So so went to Ave, and fantastic experience. We can talk more about that if you want to, but I had a wonderful experience there. Ended up took me a while to finish the dissertation, which is kind of the final piece, is writing the dissertation, which is like, what was mine in the end, like 250 pages. You basically write a book, right?
Yeah.
And but when I finished coursework and I was done with the kind of the 4-year residency period, I needed to get a job, and so I applied for, I don't know, at least 25 jobs, I think it was.
Wow.
In that time, interviewed for a few, and ironically, interviewed and was given offered a job here in the cities at St. Agnes High School, just down the road in Frogtown, and which was funny because my wife and I got married at St. Agnes. When I first moved up here to do the master's degree at the seminary, I applied. One of the jobs I applied for was a high school theology job at St. Agnes, when Father Ubel, who is now the pastor at St. Agnes, was first pastor at St. Agnes in his earlier stint.
Yeah.
And I think I did well. I mean, he told me I did well. Didn't get the job, but
God's timing.
I know, right? So anyway, I finally get back, and sometimes I would joke with Kevin Ferdinand, who's the headmaster there, that I didn't get the job initially. I had to get a master's degree and almost get a doctorate to get that job at St. Agnes.
School, young man.
Yeah. So I ended up at St. Agnes, and throughout the time was kind of off and on working on the dissertation, and eventually got that done right as I was starting the job here.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Lord's worked in your life. It's kind of brought
things
back, but it's like on a path that I would assume never would have come up with yourself.
No.
Down in
Southwest
Florida for how long? Is that like
we were there for 4 years.
4 years, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I've recently gained a soft spot in my heart for that part of the country, just because we have traveled down there with family the last few winters.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Talked about that a little bit, so we like some of the same spots. But yeah, I mean, what was it like down there? People think of Ave as this kind of like little Catholic utopia in Southwest Florida.
Oh yeah,
I don't know that it's maybe necessarily that, but it was a good experience for you, it sounds like.
No, it's great. So it's different now than when we first got there. Some people will ask like, it's like Catholic Disneyland, right? And it's like, not really.
Yeah, not quite.
It's kind of just a normal place with a giant church in the middle of it.
Yeah.
No, there's like a lot of really good families, really good faithful people that live there, but it didn't. I think maybe it was kind of, I don't know if it was part of Monahan's original intention, but it was, I think there was some expectation when it first started that it was going to be kind of like a Catholic town.
Yeah, that's what we all want, right? We want to have
we want heaven here,
shared backyards with other Catholic families, and like everything's perfect. We want heaven.
We want our heaven now rather than later.
Yeah,
but no, so it's kind of a normal place in a lot of ways. They have, I think it's Sunday mornings, like once a month or something like that. Maybe it's every Sunday. They have like a or maybe it's Saturday mornings. I can't remember which one. But they have like a farmer's market all throughout the piazza, and there's just people. It's just, it's a cool place. It actually has grown up quite a bit. When we first arrived, it felt like Catholic Disneyland. But not Disneyland when it's open, Disneyland when it's closed. When there's like nobody there. It was very small when we first showed up. I remember pulling in and parking on what they call the piazza, which is kind of like an oval shaped, that the church is right in the middle of it, and then there's parking around, and then businesses around, and some residences above the businesses. And anyway, you park, and like at Disney World or whatever, they have like what looks like a town on one side, and on the other side it's probably just nothing. It's just like a wall that just looks like a town. And there's like speakers where there's like playing music. And if you can imagine being in Disney World in that setting when there's nobody there, but the music's still playing, like you see in like movies and stuff, like horror films maybe. But it's like you hear the music, we get out, there's nobody around, we hear music playing, and there's like all these businesses, but there's nothing's open. Yeah. And actually most of them are just empty at the time. So that was kind of the first experience. Now it's very different. It's grown up quite a bit. And part of it was, for a while, I don't know if it's still the case, Southwest Florida was the fastest growing area in the country at one point.
It's still up there. A good friend of mine who, interestingly enough, got his law degree from Ave Maria. He and his family moved back there, along with a ton of other young families. And it's continuing to grow. I just saw him earlier this spring, and it's still booming. I don't know where it ranks,
especially when
you think of it as like retireeville. It still definitely is, but there's lots of young families moving in, and just the traffic even.
Oh, it's
on
crazy.
I-75 there. That's sort of my gauge, because we've gone down there the past few years, and it's just like worse every year. So there's no slowing of the
especially when you go in the winter time.
Well, right. That adds up.
No, so it's very different now. Like, especially if you want to, basically you go almost anywhere east of like Naples. It feels very different, because it used to be just totally vast, just like empty. It was like tomato fields or whatever. And now there's all these, like, I don't know, call them neighborhoods or whatever.
Tons of development.
Areas that are being built up. So, it was fastest. Ave Maria at one point was the fastest growing community in Southwest Florida.
Right.
While Southwest Florida was one of the fastest growing areas in the country. And so they were selling like at least a house a day, and so it's definitely developed quite a bit. It was really fun to be there. It was tough to be there in the summers, I have to admit. So Ave Maria is inland by, I don't know, I think it's like 30 miles or something, which is great for hurricanes, because all you get is like a storm, basically. You just get like rain and whatever.
But a different level of heat and humidity.
Humidity is crazy. When you're on the coast, you don't even realize that you get enough of the breeze that it keeps the humidity at bay. But when you're inland, it's just 100% humidity, like 100% of the time.
Yeah.
It's pretty brutal.
Yeah.
And
some
the bugs
asceticism while you're getting your doctorate.
Yeah. But that was usually in the summer. Yeah. One of the former presidents of Ave used to say that Ave Maria is like 6 months of heaven and 6 months of hell.
Good.
As far as the weather goes.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, some people in Minnesota might describe a less favorable split than that with the cold. So.
Yeah. So but the education was fantastic. Community life was second to none as far as the graduate student community went. We still have such good friends from that, and we kept up with some of them better than others, but kept up with really almost everybody. Yeah. And to some degree, and I still go down there about not quite once a year, but almost every year. They have a conference, and it's always like a reunion. Yeah. Which is really fun. And now they started integrating alumni stuff. So those who did the graduate programs, they have little things for us to kind of connect and so that it was a fantastic education, fantastic experience, and it was actually really cool because two former students from the seminary now of mine are starting in the doctoral program there starting next year, this coming year, which is really, really fun to kind of see full circle, and also to play a little bit of a part in that and encouraging them to apply to Ave, they get in, and then to encourage them to seriously consider it as their destination, and compared to some other places they could go.
Yeah.
And so it's really, really cool, edifying to see them end up there. Because it's been hugely important for me, and I think having the Ave Maria education prepared me to be at the seminary in a lot of ways, because a big part of what Father Matthew Lamb wanted to do was to ensure that his doctoral students were educated in the whole of the tradition. Not that you knew everything about everybody and everything that happened, but you had a sense of the whole of what was going on in the ancient world, what's been going on in the modern world. You had engagement across the tradition. You're taking courses, on the fathers and scripture and in systematic stuff, and you're studying Aquinas, and you're reading, conciliar texts. You're reading John Paul II. You're just getting exposure to the whole Catholic tradition, and because he always lamented that even among Catholic scholars, sometimes you have this where he called this ignorant ignorance, where you just don't know what you don't know, right? So the real place to be is a certain learned ignorance, where you know what you don't know, you know your blind spots, and you can really only have that by having that exposure to the whole. And so, but the thing about the exposure to the whole is that that's really kind of equipped me to teach all sorts of different things. Even if I had never taught this thing before, I have enough awareness of what's going on in the whole of theology that I can tap into that. I can go that way. So, for instance, the Dean Thompson has asked me twice to do a fundamental moral theology course. I wasn't trained as a moral theologian, and I'm trying to remember the last time I had a moral theology course myself.
Yeah.
But I was equipped to do it just because of the nature of my education and the equipment I was given to be able to engage and know where to look, and having the resources, and also the community among the graduate students and former instructors to tap into. So yeah.
What all are you teaching right now, or what's kind of in your
well, this year, so I've got this past summer I taught ecclesiology for lay students in the Master of Arts in Theology program. And that was really fun. Great group. We had 12 students for summer class, which is actually, for a summer class, is quite a bit, because we usually, those summer classes are intense. We literally call them intensive. It's a 2-week, typically 4 hours a day.
Wow.
And then in between
Pack
class,
a lot in.
class, then you're, they've got readings and other things they have to work on before the next class. So it's like 8 to noon every day is a typical way to do it for 2 weeks. So 12 for that, and that was a lot of fun. Great group for ecclesiology, so theology of the church. This past fall I had fundamental moral theology, as I mentioned, and another ecclesiology class, both for what we call the Theology 2 men, so guys that are in their second year of their kind of major theological formation. And the poor guys had me for 2 classes, 4 days a week. They had to put up with me, thankfully in 2 different classrooms, so that it wasn't so psychologically jarring.
Change the scenery up.
Yeah, exactly.
Stay in their good graces. That's good.
And then let's see. And then I had a seminar course called Secunda Secundae, which is looking at the second half of the second part of the Summa Theologiae of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is kind of basically virtues, vices, gifts of the Holy Spirit, in particular. So kind of looking at faith and hope and charity and the related virtues, and the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, and the counter, the vices that go against all those different virtues. And it's pretty extensive. So that was a really fun class. And it was, like I said, it was kind of like a seminar. We sat around in a circle. I did most of the talking, as I've done today, even.
That's the point.
Yeah, exactly.
Trust me, that's good.
Right.
It's better than the alternative.
Yeah, but we had, so that, and then now I'm doing what's called the Tertia Pars, the third part of the Summa, where Aquinas turns and starts looking into Christology, so the theology of Jesus Christ, the Incarnation, the life of Christ, and the sacraments, and sacramental theology.
That's awesome. So you've mentioned Aquinas a couple of times. You've mentioned the Summa. I know you've studied Aquinas quite a bit, and his work is obviously very prevalent just in theological formation, Catholic educational circles. But for just the normal, Joe Schmo like me, who was St. Thomas Aquinas, and why have his teachings continued to sort of permeate on down through the ages to where we're at today?
Yeah, there's a lot to say. So the University of St. Thomas is St. Thomas, not after Thomas the Apostle, but St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
So he's our patron saint, which is really kind of fun. And you'll see some statues of St. Thomas around campus. The famous arches has the statue of St. Thomas with one of the prayers that he wrote. That a lot of you pray that before faculty senate meetings and often before class or whatever is to start class. So St. Thomas Aquinas, he was a 13th century Dominican friar priest, philosopher, theologian. He so he wasn't one of the first to follow St. Dominic in kind of joining the Dominican order, the order of preachers, but he was kind of in a subsequent generation. His teacher was St. Albert the Great, one of his teachers was St. Albert the Great, who was basically, he was kind of the world's expert in like 11 different disciplines simultaneously. So this guy's just absolute brilliant, genius, savant. And Aquinas studies with him. And what Aquinas really takes away and really focuses on is on the chief sciences. So Albert is involved in all sorts of things, botany, etc. And Aquinas cares, not that he doesn't care about those things, but he really cares about theology and philosophy, but especially the theological sciences. So he gets involved in that and studies at the University of Paris, becomes a professor there, if you want to put it that way, after joining the Dominican order. And his life is relatively short. He lives about 50 years. But his output is enormous as far as what he's able to do in that time. He just writes a ton. And part of it, he had the benefit of being absolutely brilliant, but then having like scribes and secretaries that he could just dictate to. There's like legends of like, for instance, where he's like writing 3 things at once, and he's got 3 different secretaries, and he tells one sentence and tells another sentence, and he's writing 3 different texts simultaneously.
About 3
different things. Wow. And just got I can't even write one text,
See, I can't think about one thing. Incredible.
So but the most important thing about Aquinas is his sanctity. He is he's brilliant, but he's an extremely holy man, known for his sanctity, for his chastity, for his piety. He would spend, I think every day he would say Mass himself, and then he would serve for a Mass as well. And often he'd be, as he was like engaging in a theological question, you'd find him in the chapel in front of the Blessed Sacrament, in front of the tabernacle, kind of bringing it to the Lord and looking for that kind of inspiration of the Holy Spirit for the clarity. There's some stories about, one story in particular about, the crucifix speaking to him, saying, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What shall be your reward?"
That's kind of toward the end of his
life. Towards the end of his life. Yeah. And Aquinas beautifully says in response, "My reward is nothing other than you, O Lord." And so,
man, if we could all have faith like that.
Yeah, and so this, like, one of his friar brothers like kind of walks in on this and like sees this kind of happening of Aquinas speaking to Jesus on the cross after Jesus speaks to him from the cross, this kind of miraculous event, or this kind of mystical event. And so his long-standing importance is I think first and foremost his sainthood, his sanctity as being a saint of the church and a great saint of the church. And then secondarily, he's considered a doctor of the church. And so there's, a number of these doctors of the church where popes have decided that this particular saint is someone that we can listen to with confidence, that they represent what the church, how the church thinks about a certain, typically like a certain issue. Not that they're exclusive to that. So, for instance, Augustine is kind of called the doctor of grace. So, if you want to know how the church thinks about grace, read some Augustine. Augustine's going to give you a good sense of that. Not that that's only what he does, but and so Aquinas is referred to as common doctor or the universal doctor, and also the angelic doctor. And part of the angelic is that he's kind of an expert on angels. Yeah. And he also was very angelic in his own kind of dimension. Like part of his chastity was as if he were an angel, and that he never had to suffer. And part of it, he passed a certain test, when he was put into a particular moment, and the sense was that from that time on, he didn't really ever struggle with the sins of the flesh that way or anything. So he kind of had a demeanor of an angel. But he's called common doctor, universal doctor, because he is a doctor for all, about all, if you will. So just about anything in theology, you can go to Thomas with confidence, right? That's kind of what the church is saying by that. And so whether it's on grace, whether it's on sacraments, whether it's on the incarnation, whether it's on the moral life, the nature of the Trinity, fill in the blank, Aquinas is kind of your guy. Not that he's the only guy. Part of why he is that, giants stand on the shoulders of giants. And he would see himself as standing on the shoulder of giants. So part of the brilliance of Aquinas is that he always saw himself as utterly indebted to the tradition that precedes him. And so he was obsessed with the fathers of the church, in a good way. He would, anytime he would travel and go to a new city, he wanted to find out where are the libraries. And this is, back before there's like public library stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like where are the monasteries at that I could go find a library? And what do they have in that library that I've not yet read? And he would read it and try to commit it to memory and move on. Because, no smartphones, you couldn't just like take pictures and look at it later. You couldn't scan it. Couldn't make a facsimile.
Yeah.
He had to just kind of commit it to memory. And so he knew the fathers so well that the popes, the Pope asked him to basically put together a series of what the fathers had to say on the Gospel of Matthew. And he did such a good job with it that he was asked to do Mark and then Luke and then John. And it's called the Catena Aria, where it's the golden chain, where you can see, if you want to know what the fathers and the tradition has to say about, what's going on in the Gospels, that's like your first stop, really. Yeah. It's really cool. And he knew the scriptures. And he knew the major philosophers, and not just Aristotle. He's known for being an Aristotelian, but he knew Plato, and he had a kind of Platonic element to his thinking, and he knew the Islamic philosophers of Averroes and Avicenna. He knew the Jewish philosophers. He knew Maimonides, and he was really trying to incorporate all of these things. Like I said, he knew very clearly he stood on the shoulder of giants. And he was, as an educator, if you will, and not just in his time, but for the church, he wanted to seek the truth at all times, the truth no matter the source, and ultimately that is from God, right? God who teaches. And that's how he saw what is happening in the scriptures, is it's divine revelation. God is teaching us. And so that's why he would talk about theology itself as Sacra Doctrina, or holy teaching, because it's first God who teaches, and then it's the theologian who teaches from the teaching of God, if you will. And so that's what theology ultimately is for him, was Sacra Doctrina. It's holy teaching that is first just kind of given to the church, to the people of God, by God himself. And from that, then we proceed into kind of a rational way of appropriating that. And that's what theology is.
Hello, thanks for watching this video. I'm Father Brian Gross, Director of Pastoral Formation at the Saint Paul Seminary in Saint Paul, Minnesota. What we do here at the seminary is form men to be joyful, holy Catholic priests for you and for your family. The church is very clear. Forming a man to be a priest is the most important work that the church does, because you need to receive the Eucharist, you need to have your confession heard, you need the good counsel and the holy example of good and holy priests. Here, the faculty and staff at the seminary seek every day to make sure that these men who are ordained priests are as good, holy, healthy, happy as they possibly can. Please donate to the Saint Paul Seminary so that the work we do can continue for years to come. You'll find a link in the description. God bless you. Be assured of our prayers.
How prevalent are these teachings and kind of his work in seminary formation today specifically?
Well, that's an excellent question.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's why you get paid the big bucks.
Gave me a pregnant pause there. Thanks, man.
No, they're hugely important. So the church, through the Second Vatican Council and through multiple popes, and through the Code of Canon Law and other things, mentions Aquinas explicitly by name as how should seminarians be formed? Well, they need to know the scriptures, they need to know the teachings of the church, the magisterium, and they need to know the fathers, and they also need to be taught in the manner of St. Thomas Aquinas. And so he's the only one that's mentioned by name, and repeatedly by all these different sources. Like I said, in the council, popes, canon law, and even just the documents that we have for seminary formation, the program for priestly formation, Ratio Fundamentalis, all emphasize the importance of a Thomistic bearing. That doesn't mean we follow Aquinas in every minute detail of, because he, for instance, was wrong about the Immaculate Conception, right? So people maybe are aware of that. But as far as the principles go, so even if there's like a detail here and there, the principles, that's what really kind of remains. And so kind of sticking with his principles, following his principles. And it's not idiosyncratic where it's just like Aquinas because Aquinas was just brilliant. It's Aquinas because the way in which he was able to synthesize the tradition, as I was saying. He kind of brings it all together in a holistic way of thinking. That doesn't mean you have to be a Thomist to be a priest, where you're like Aquinas or else or something. Yeah. But he definitely gives something and to how a seminarian should be formed to think with the mind of the church. And part of it is even also, if you want to say, to the Dominican order's own way of doing things, which started very early with St. Dominic and his early followers, which is we contemplate in order to share the fruits of contemplation. And in some ways, that's kind of what seminary formation is at the intellectual level, is contemplating the truths of God in order to share the fruits of one's contemplation. And hopefully the priest does that throughout his whole priesthood, right? That his homily prep is not just him winging it on a Sunday morning, but like he's entering into the truth of these things, of what God is revealing, so that he can share that. And that's kind of, so Aquinas provides all of these different dimensions, as well as the kind of sophistication of kind of high-level philosophical thought and technical distinctions, etc.
Yeah.
He does a lot of that for providing, just the apparatus for how to kind of think about the reality that God has given.
There seems to be beauty in that it's not just contemplation or this knowledge or wisdom like for its own sake, but it's ordered to an end of like distilling it and sharing it, right? Because that's how truth gets spread. I mean, that's the work you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Sense as an educator, that's the work every priest does when he's engaging his community.
So Aquinas has this beautiful. He's got this section at the end of what's called the Secundus Secundae on perfection and the state of perfection. And in the ordinary course of things, so he talks about there's the active life and there's the contemplative life. And everybody, he says, every Christian needs to have both of those things to a certain extent. So contemplative, you would think of like Carthusian monks who like spend their day in prayer and in silence, etc. They still have some elements of the active, right? Somebody's got to cook and clean up and like, set up for liturgy, and like there's things that have to be done that's at the very kind of active practical level. Most lay Catholics in the world are really predominant in the active life, right? That like, what are you predominantly taken up with but action, right? You're doing things.
Yeah.
But everybody should have some contemplation. And so Aquinas asks, all right, which is the more perfect? And at one level, it's really like if you choose between them, it's the contemplative, right? That's the more perfect. That's the higher calling, if you will. So the Carthusian monk is doing something more important with his life, with his time. That doesn't mean that like I'm less important or something, but what he's called to is a higher thing than somebody in the active life, and that's just kind of like an objective thing.
Yeah.
But Aquinas kind of throws a wrench in it because he says, actually, so that's true, he says, but those who contemplate to then enter into the active life to share the fruits of their contemplation, that is the most perfect this side of heaven. Heaven really will be the contemplation. Not that there won't ever be like activity, but really what is the essence of heaven but the contemplation of God? And so you would think like that is the most important, but he said, no, this side of heaven, it's the contemplative who shares the fruit of their contemplation in their preaching and in their kind of how that overflows such that the charity for God overflows into an active charity for neighbor.
Yeah.
Is the idea.
How many kids do you have?
6.
So you're much more in tune with the active life.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you balance the active life versus the contemplative?
You're presuming that I do.
How do you integrate them? We're not supposed to talk about balance anymore. We're supposed to talk about integration.
Yes,
That's kind of the new thing.
The
like,
new
how
thing,
do you
yeah.
integrate it all? Because balance is basically impossible. Debate that if you will. But yeah, I mean, there's beauty in both. And like you said, we're all called to maybe a different mix of those two things. But what does that look like in
No, that's a good
life?
question.
As a father of 6, I mean, that's...
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'll say is that I go to confession because I'm not perfect.
It's a great start. I laugh, but there's a lot of beauty in that.
Yeah, so
Yes.
I fail at it.
Yes.
But thankfully, I think some of what I do in the active dimension, if you will, is something of a contemplation. So,
Sure.
So as I'm like prepping for class, there's an active dimension to that for sure, because I've got to type up notes and I'm looking at this book and this book. But actually, I think most of it is kind of more contemplative.
Yeah.
Where I'm, say I'm I try to do the readings, the same readings I assign to my students, plus other things. But as I'm doing that, there is a certain just kind of contemplation there, and I try to allow myself for it to be kind of something of a atmosphere of prayer, if you will, as I'm reading these things, so that it's not just kind of information from this source to my brain kind of thing, but it's these. So if I'm reading Augustine or I'm reading Gregory of Nyssa or something, it's this person and me looking at the same reality, if that makes sense. Rather than just him telling me something, there's not just a two-way thing. We're both looking at a reality. And ultimately, that's the reality of God, right? Or whatever God is revealing about the human person, about sin, about grace, about our lives, whatever that might be. And so as I have a disposition to the reality, then it's less active and more contemplative. So I think my profession lends to that. Not everything in my profession lends to that because I'm like on committees and I got to like put together.
You have emails to answer.
Yeah, emails to answer, some of which I haven't answered, and I really
to
should.
the club.
Yeah, so there's always that. But so there's that. I think I'm not faithful to every single day. I'm not even in the office necessarily every single day, but try to join for Mass or Vespers at the seminary. That's just huge benefit of working at the seminary is that it's just like right there. And the other thing is that the chapel is just right there. So even if I don't get to Mass or for Vespers, I can just stop in and take some time for prayer and interrupt what I'm doing. Yeah. So there's those dimensions. I've got, couple men's groups that I try to be a part of. We do, like one of them, we do adoration once a week and then hang out for coffee afterwards. So there's those dimensions. Just, my own kind of prayer life and whatnot.
I feel like even if you're not in your line of work, there are ways to build contemplation in, right? And it can even be in some of the simple ways. I'm thinking back to when you were blowing dust out of computers and taking them apart and rebuilding them. Even if you're in a trade or something, you could get to the adoration chapel, but you can also take just silent moments when you get them, right? Like, we're all called to some semblance of that. Would you agree?
Yeah. No, I think I heard this quote. I forget the name of the rabbi. There was this Jewish rabbi, modern Jewish rabbi, who said, "Those who work with the hands Sabbath with the mind, and those that work with the mind Sabbath with the hands." And I think that's very true for me. If you or somebody that's like a white collar job or whatever, you're on a computer all day, or it's like meetings, or it's that kind of stuff. There's something contemplative and sabbatical and restful, refreshing in just doing things like going home and doing the dishes, or digging a hole, or putting up a fence, or
mowing the lawn,
whatever it is.
So cathartic. It's beautiful.
There's something about that lends me to an opportunity for me to enter into. It's not like silence per se, but there's a certain contemplation that can happen in that. And maybe I'm just in the habit of it now, but I don't even actually necessarily like choose to do it. It just kind of happens. But I think there's always a decision to take the time.
Yeah.
And so that's like, getting up in the mornings. I try to get up before anybody in the house is up, and I make coffee. And I have my prayer chair that I sit in just for that. It's not used for anything else. It's just basically at the top of the stairs. We have a little landing spot, and I just sit there by the window. I light a candle. I've got some texts that I'll read. I got some prayers that I kind of pray through. But even just some of that routine is just I just have prompts to myself, one of which is just gratitude. Or gratitudes, I think it actually says. And I just go through and just, even simple things. I'm grateful. Thank you, Lord, for this cup of coffee, that I'm sitting in a house with a roof over my head and it's warm and, the sun's coming up, or, that kind of stuff. And I think through the day, the Lord says sufficient for the day is its own evil. And so I think of what's the evil of the day? Meaning what are the things I'm thinking about that I need to attend to today? Not that I'm thinking about tomorrow, I'm just thinking about today, and I kind of bring the Lord into that. So I think, just to kind of get to the short of it, taking the time, you have to take the time, really. And I used to tell my high schoolers, a lot of building a prayer life or building one's spiritual life is just putting in the time.
Yeah.
You just got to put in
Show
time.
up.
You just got to show up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not that I'm perfect at, because like I said, I still go to confession, and there's days in which family life just throws a wrench in things and whatever. But
yeah, you gave a talk just last night. You were talking about receiving the sacraments well.
Yeah,
that's a big piece of it too, right? Especially as Catholics, we have this gift of, call it access to Christ in this very real sacramental way. So what is it? I'm not saying repeat your whole talk, but at a high level, what does it mean to receive the sacraments well? And what does that look like practically for people like me and you?
Yeah, so I'll just start first with liturgy. So getting back to the previous question in a certain sense, liturgy itself is rest for us. Now it still requires work, and a certain work of the mind, of the spirit. So one of the things I talked about last night is how St. Thomas Aquinas talks about worship, and how worship is primarily, principally a spiritual activity that happens in conjunction with bodily activity. So genuflection, bowing, whatever we might do. But he says the bodily things that we do, and that would include even kind of the bodily actions of sacraments, right? That the bodily actions, he says, are both a sign of the interior of the spirit, the spiritual worship, but also dispose us or incite in us the spiritual worship. So, and he says that's not just bodily actions, but even like words of praise and like what we say. And so those things are meant to kind of proceed out of the spiritual worship and lead us to a deeper worship. And so I think, liturgy and the sacramental life, kind of the main point of my talk last night is, you sometimes hear this in like sports. Like I'm sure like if you played high school football or something, you probably heard a coach say something like, keep the main thing, or something like that, right?
Oh, yeah.
And like, what does that mean? Well, that means it's easy to get distracted with things that are important, but not the most important, right? And so I was kind of applying that to our own sacramental life as Catholics, is that sometimes we get a little distracted with things that are not the most important aspect. And so my point was, sacraments are tools. They're instruments of grace. They're instruments of our own worship of God. And so we can't treat them like magic or like even idolize the sacraments themselves in a way, because we want to see them as instruments to our own sanctification. And the sanctification essentially consists of what's going on on the inside in the spiritual, like with charity, right? So Aquinas will describe holiness. He says, what is holiness? But essentially it's charity, and then it's secondarily everything else that we think about when it comes to holiness. But it's really love for God. That's what holiness consists of, is really just love for God. And so my point in my talk was thinking about the sacraments with a view to the love of God, and thinking about them in terms of how do they nourish faith, hope, and charity, and how does faith, hope, and charity need to be activated in our reception of the sacraments, and particularly sacraments of Eucharist and confession, because those are the ones that we have a certain regularity with.
Right.
Not that you can't do that when you're getting married or ordained, or if you're coming into the church or something along those lines. So, for instance, the act of faith should be operative in our reception of communion. Like, we believe the Lord when he says, my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. So there's a certain belief there. We have a hope in what he says, that whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood will have life eternal. So there should be a certain hope in that. And lastly should just be a love, right? That, as Christ says, no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends, that we need to have a certain kind of love response, and that really that's the right way to receive Holy Communion, is always in a spirit of charity, because that's really what communion is for, to deepen our charity for God. And that's the proper effect of the Eucharist, is to deepen our charity for God. Yeah. And so thinking about the sacraments in terms of that interior life and what's going on, and the most important things, the main thing is the main thing. And what does that consist of essentially for the Christian? It's faith, it's hope, it's charity.
Yeah. Say a little more on the confession side of things. How do I bring faith, hope, and charity, or make sure that those are central elements of
so
a good confession?
St. Thomas Aquinas will describe penance, the sacrament of penance or confession or reconciliation, in terms of the virtue, he says, of penance. And so part of what's activated in our going to confession is the activity of penance, of being penitential, of being, in other words, in being repentant, right? So what is the virtue of penance but kind of being repentant? And so that's what's going on there. He says, so what's going on with penance is that repentance is kind of coextensive with, or concomitant with, it goes along with faith, hope, and charity. That it's kind of the door to those these other virtues. And really, true repentance is fueled by that charity. And so I think you can do the same that there should be an act of faith, an act of hope, and an act of charity in going to confession, and especially like the priest is praying the prayer of absolution. So like belief in that just like in terms of so belief that when the Lord gave his authority to forgive sins to the apostles, right? So whosoever sins you forgive are forgiven. There's an act of faith that like Christ is forgiving me through the ministry of the priest. Hope in life eternal, that this is part of how God wants to lead me to himself is through this repentance, that I'm on his path again, or just more deeply on the path. And then charity, same thing, is that like we talk about contrition, right? And the church will describe perfect contrition versus imperfect contrition. And imperfect contrition we also call attrition. And what is imperfect contrition is, so perfect contrition is to be sorrowful for one's sins, to have a repentance for one's sins, precisely because of a pure love for God. Attrition is where there's a less than perfect, but not bad, a less than perfect motivation. And that could be like fear of missing out on heaven,
right? Fear
of going to hell. And so what do we do in the act of contrition? We kind of cover all of our bases. We say, because I fear hell or the loss of heaven, but most of all, because I offended you who are all good and deserving of all my love. Well, that second piece is the perfect contrition. The first piece is the imperfect contrition. And so, part of the beauty of the sacrament of confession is that perfect contrition by itself would be enough that we wouldn't have to go to confession, kind of just in the grand scheme of things. Like if I had perfect contrition, I don't need confession, simply speaking. Now, it's always better to go because, like, if you have perfect contrition, you're going to do everything you can to make sure you're right with God.
That's kind of circular.
Yeah, right.
That makes sense.
But if you have imperfect contrition, the power of the sacrament is that in the absolution, Aquinas says that as long as you don't put an obstacle to it, the grace of the Holy Spirit can kind of transform your imperfect contrition to a perfect contrition. As long as you don't have an obstacle to the grace. You don't put something in the way of it. That's kind of the natural result of the sacrament, if you will. That's what it's for, is to transform our imperfect contrition to a perfect contrition, so that we're, if you want to put it this way, it's really simple. Like the sacrament of confession is to restore us to charity with God, to restore the charity. The sacrament of the Eucharist is to deepen the charity. And not that you can't deepen charity through confession or something. You can purify it, right? You can be more pure. Same thing with the Eucharist. But that's really the goal of the sacrament of confession, is to restore charity, and communion is to strengthen it or deepen it.
Sure. So good. I'm going to completely change subjects.
All right, let's do it.
Have a good segue, and I want to be respectful of your time, which we're coming toward the end of, too. Artificial intelligence. So this comes from, you and I were actually at like a staff lunch, and I think we're talking with one of the other priests and maybe a couple other people just about AI is becoming more popular. It's becoming more ubiquitous, and I use it in some of my everyday work. I know a lot of other people do. At the same time, I'm always kind of wondering, like somewhere in the back of my mind is like, what are the moral implications of all these very, very quickly changing technologies that we're seeing? And I know that's like a very loaded question. How do you even begin to answer that? But sometimes it just helps to sort of throw that out there. Like, okay, like what is happening? I think we need to be aware, right? Like you need to be spiritually aware of any action we're taking. And when it comes to technology, especially AI, yeah, it's just moving and growing so fast. So, what have you played around with AI much yourself at all? Why or why not? And like, what things should just kind of the everyday Catholic be, I guess, maybe on the lookout for, or bringing to conversations around rapidly changing technology, AI or otherwise?
Yeah.
How's that for a loaded question?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'm not the best person to ask about this, to be perfectly honest. In that it's not something that I know a lot about. I know people that know a lot about these things. Does that count for anything?
It counts for a lot. One of my theories actually is no one really knows a whole lot about it because it's changing so fast. Like if you say you're an expert, by the time you've gained expertise in it, it's changed.
Yeah,
that's kind of what maybe scary things about it.
Yeah.
But anyway,
It's the kind of like the short of it is, it's a tool, right? And so just like any other tool, any human artifact can be used for good or for ill, and so I think that principle always stands, is that it's a tool that's a product of our own rationality, right? To be perfectly frank, that's why they try to find chimps using tools as proof of their rationality. Like, tools are just proof of rationality, and we have a lot of tools because we're highly rational. Yeah. And what is AI but a product of that, right? And so it just, in some ways, it says something about us that we're able to do that, right? We're able to create this thing. And so it does, there's something to be said about AI, but it's always reflective of the maker in an ultimate way. And we made AI, right? So, and it's a tool that can be used for ill or for good. And so the ethical dimensions, really, first and foremost, is not so much about the technology or the capability itself. There are some things, some technological things that we have, or certain tools that we have, is kind of hard to find how there would be a good function out of it. But that's not those are like really rare. Usually with tools, we're talking about things that are pretty much neutral. Right? Yeah. AI is neutral. It can be used for all sorts of. I'm sure you use it for lots of good things for work, right? And I know a lot of people that do. It's an efficiency thing for a lot of people. It's like, yeah, could I read through all of this and try to distill it? But it's like, not really. That's not really part of my job. I just kind of need it for this one thing. It's not that different. This is oversimplification, but if I'm trying to find a certain quote from this certain author in this one book that I know it's in there somewhere, could I go to the library and get the book? Sometimes I do, and I just go and find it. Sometimes I can just go on Google Books and just do a Control F.
Yeah.
And search and find it, and it's like, it just makes things more efficient, right? AI has that possibility. But with any tool, there has to be limits, moral limits, and that's one of the main questions, I think, among those who are working in AI. My brother is in the IT world, and this is one of the things that a lot of people are deeply aware of, is that hypothetically you could ask AI to basically give you, for instance, like how to make a bomb or something, right? Sure. And there's things that you don't want just anybody to have access to, right?
Absolutely.
How to build a nuclear bomb in your basement or whatever. Like, you don't want that. You want certain kind of protections, I guess.
Yeah.
And so that's part of what's being built in some of the development of these AI programs, is some of those protections. And I think that's one of the first things, is how can we upfront make sure that it's not used for ill, right?
Yeah.
Another dimension is a certain awareness of personhood, and I think that's a big thing. Because basically what AI does is it imitates how humans operate, and that's part of why we call it artificial intelligence. Is that it seems to be exactly how humans work, because we've designed it to be that way, right? And so that's a key dimension, is starting to ask questions about dignity and questions about personhood and autonomy and freedom, etc. What I would recommend is, I forget the name of the document. I think it's Antiqua et Nova or something like that.
That's exactly it.
From the Vatican on artificial intelligence. I've not had a chance to read it yet, but from what I hear from others that have read it, it's really good. There's a lot of really
bad that I plugged it into ChatGPT and had it spit out a summary.
No, I'm sure you're not the only one. I'm pretty sure there was a Catholic news organization that did that too.
Sure.
I think the Pillar did that at one point. They used ChatGPT to summarize.
Sounds very Pillar-esque.
Yeah,
I'm sure they did. No, it's actually really good though. Like, it's cool to see the church play sort of an active leading role and have a voice in the conversation.
Yeah,
because ultimately the church that Christ established, like who's better to speak about what it means to be a human person in light of all these?
Yeah, Saint Paul the Sixth said that he had this kind of pithy way of saying it, like the church is an expert in humanity.
There you go.
Right, and part of that's just from paying a lot of attention over many years to what it means to be human and the moral life and those questions. But honestly, part of it, the biggest part of it, is that we have the revelation through Jesus Christ and even just through the scriptures of what is a human, what are we made for, what is our dignity and value, where does it come from? And as the Second Vatican Council described, Christ came not only to reveal God to man, but man to himself, right? So what does it mean to be human? What is our destiny? What does it mean to grow in one's own humanity, et cetera? So I think the church is rightfully on that kind of front stage to pay attention to these questions.
Yeah. I feel like there was already maybe concern that folks would lose their ability to critically think before AI was even super popular.
Yeah.
Do you see that as maybe a scaled up pitfall now?
Yeah, I've got a friend who just here at St. Thomas in computer science, actually, and we hang out and talk. And that is a kind of, as an educator, right? And that's part of it, is that we're not just coming as scholars and talking to each other. We're talking about it as educators too. Like, there's that dimension, is like just a question of rationality, and could we inadvertently kind of self-sabotage or give up some of the higher functioning of what it means to be human and letting other things kind of take that on? And I think there's always kind of a little bit of give and take there, right? There's like, could I just go through the code for the IRS and do my taxes just on a sheet of paper? I mean, I remember doing taxes on paper, but now I just have H&R Block online. So that was not a plug, but I just use
H&R Block is not. It's not endorsement.
It's not an endorsement. Yeah, they do not sponsor the seminary.
Not a bad idea.
Yeah, right. But there's a certain kind of less rational way in which I do it now, in which it's online through this app or whatever, and it kind of simplifies it for me. But that's in some ways to free me up for other things, right? Sure. And so it's not as an ultimate replacement. Like what's that Pixar movie about the robots and
WALL-E?
WALL-E, yeah, where it's like humans are really just animals,
right, with
passions that are being, kind of indulged,
right, and
the robots are really doing all the hard work and the heavy lifting. That's in some ways kind of an oversimplification, but I think there's always that dimension of it and so part of it's asking, what is even the nature of education? And if education is not just training for tasks, because 20 years, whatever those tasks are, well, a computer's probably going to be doing that way better, or even less time than 20 years. So it's not just the training of tasks, but it's the formation of the human person, and how to be more human, how to think, how to engage in the highest parts of our humanity. That's kind of what the university has always been set up to do from its its foundation, and when universities were started in the Middle Ages, is to kind of get human persons to tap into the highest things, into highest ways of being. And a computer can never do that, because it's not going to be able to, kind of. It can do some of the, again, it's more at the practical level. And this is why in the theological world, we talk about the primacy of the speculative over the practical, kind of getting back to the contemplative and active thing. The speculative is the truth for its own sake, knowing for knowing's sake. The practical is knowing for the sake of doing. And we live in a very pragmatic world that is knowing for the sake of doing. But the more ultimate aspect of humanity is knowing for the sake of knowing. Right, that's just a higher fulfillment of our being. So, I think that's keeping that in mind and thinking about AI and how that could rob some people from that higher activity. I think that's something to pay attention to. I don't have all the answers, but I think it's a factor that should be on the table as far as how we think about the engagement.
Suppose conversely, if you're approaching it through the right framework and you sort of limit your use of it to the practical, kind of tactical, repetitive tasks, maybe that, I'm just thinking especially now of how much time, especially in America, we spend working. We talk about the grind, we talk about the hustle. Now, I'm not saying we should all just lay around and, let my AI agent do all the work, but if it's doing, those more repetitive, maybe less human tasks, and could it free me up more to do more knowing for the sake of knowing?
Yeah. There's even just the dimension of like, is it doing the essence of your job for you?
Yeah.
Such that, so I know of through a friend who worked in IT, and he had a coworker where anytime he would, through like some messaging app or whatever, ask him a question, he kind of kept suspecting that he was just answering from AI. Like it was never ever from him, even though he's supposed to be the expert on this thing.
Yeah.
It was just an AI response, and it's like, well, why do you work here? I could just ask AI.
Right.
Then you're just letting the AI do your job. It's a kind of like what do they call that? Soft quitting or whatever, quiet quitting.
Yeah.
It's kind of what it was. It was a quiet quitting,
Yeah.
And that's morally problematic.
Right.
And for instance, I don't think I'm comfortable with letting AI answer my emails for me.
Yeah.
Because then it's kind of disingenuous. That seems that I'm actually responding to someone when I'm not actually responding to that person.
Yeah. That's like a violation of the truth at that point.
Yeah, it's misrepresentation. It's acting as if I'm engaged with this person when I'm actually not, and so there's problems there.
Yeah.
So, and I think some of it is kind of straightforward. If you've got a moral compass, and an active conscience, you're going to be paying attention to these things.
Yeah, first principles didn't go away just because OpenAI released the latest version of ChatGPT.
Yeah, and so if you're a faithful Christian who's engaging in the work of the conscience, even if you're just examining your conscience to go to confession and things like, then you're already thinking about what is right and what is wrong, and you're going to be attentive to, I'm not sure if this would be right, because this would be false.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay, last one. We'll get you out of here. I can't let you off the hook.
Okay.
And without getting on the record.
Oh, I know where this is going.
I know where this is going. Of why you're a Packers fan.
Yeah.
I'm not really speaking for myself because I'm from Nebraska, where our professional sport team is the University of Nebraska.
Yeah.
But having lived in this state
now that they are professional,
right? Yeah, there's less of a there's more of a blurring of the lines there than ever. So it really all does make sense at the collegiate level. But yeah, no, you're a diehard Packers fan. I see you with the Packers hat on every once in a while.
Yeah.
You have some good talks in the kitchen sometimes.
Well,
football. But how did that happen? Because you're from Minnesota.
No, I'm actually from Illinois.
You're from Illinois. Okay.
I'm from Central Illinois.
Did you end up here first for undergrad? Is that the deal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So from Illinois and went to college and did a master's in Minnesota, and then doctorate in Florida. And so, never lived in Wisconsin, right? So, when at least at the time, so I was growing up in the 90s, and in Illinois, that meant you were a Bulls fan, right? Because it was the Michael Jordan era. And so everybody.
Yeah, I'm gonna totally. Did you see The Last Dance?
I did, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We won't go down too far that rabbit hole, but man, yes. Yeah. That's kind of like our childhood too, like
it was very nostalgic. Yeah.
Maybe more surface level as you're a kid, you're just like this is the best player ever. He's this global icon, but that takes you behind the scenes, and it brings you back.
It was cool.
They did
it was cool. It was a little disturbing too, because it kind of shattered a little bit of the image too, where you start seeing people in a little bit of their lower humanity or something. You're like, oh, I wish I wouldn't.
Yeah,
I had this kind of view of people, and anyway, it's all the brokenness.
Yeah,
but there was like a total nostalgia because watching certain games, right? Like the flu game.
Yeah,
there's certain things. There's like I remember watching that game.
Brings you back.
So anyway, Bulls fan, and then in Peoria, it feels like it's right on the line between the Cardinals and the Cubs.
Sure,
nobody cares about the Sox. In Peoria. There was a weird couple friends that were like weirdos that liked the Blackhawks. It's like, why do you like hockey? Nobody plays hockey.
Fighting words.
Well, in Illinois though, right? This is Illinois. I think hockey's awesome, but I was like, it was not a thing.
Understood.
And so football, it was the Bears, and the Bears were terrible, and nobody really cared about the Bears either. But I got into the Packers thanks to Brett Favre, really. He just had this love for the game, and he just was this dynamic person, and just was, just watching him play, he just had a passion and heart. And my parents got me this subscription of Sports Illustrated for Kids.
Oh man, you're really taking me back.
I know, right?
I also was a
and
proud
there's like
subscriber
this like poster that came along with it of like the major players every time.
Out poster, and you could put them up on the.
And one of the first ones was Brett Favre that I got, and then
I'll get you.
I remember watching the Super Bowl where when he's running across with the helmet after they won the Super Bowl '97, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And
Patriots, the Drew Bledsoe.
Yeah, Drew Bledsoe. Yeah, and then so that I had that, and then in high school I had friends, just like good Catholic dudes that were at the Catholic. I went to public school. They were at the Catholic high school, who were all Packers fans for some reason. And so like we hung out and watched games. And then I went to college and in the seminary, and that's where seminary, you get guys from like South Dakota and Wisconsin and Minnesota and all over. Yeah. And so I had all these Wisconsin guys, and everybody in South Dakota was a Packers fan.
Sure.
And so we'd watch games together. That solidified it even more. Then I went to doctoral studies, and one of my best friends from doctoral program is the biggest Packers fan I've ever met.
Really?
And I would watch almost every single game for 4 years straight with him in his living room. So a lot of factors that continually.
No, that's what sports should be. We joke about it being so corporate, and I used to work in it, so somewhat of a unique perspective. But that's what it's about. Like, it's about bringing people together.
Yeah.
It's about some of those formative, just that idea of like being part of something bigger than yourself, even if it's that surface level is supporting a team. I think there's some virtue in that.
I've had to go a little detached at times because like I'm getting a little too in this.
Oh, I hear you there.
I need to step back. It's not that important. It doesn't determine my life.
Yeah.
So it's fun. If it stays fun, then everything's going fine.
Sports, it's supposed to be fun.
Yeah.
Amen. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much
for
taking the time and letting us kind of jump all over the place.
This is great.
AI to moral theology to
Packers.
I think we covered it all. But God bless you and your work.
Yeah, thank you.
Do it again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil.